Haven of Rest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 2, June 12th, 2016. The lesson is entitled The Consequence of Disobedience. The lesson comes from Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. We were asked to read the same. The time is roughly 625 to 635 BC. The place is in Jerusalem. In this lesson on the consequences of disobedience, we may have to stretch our thinking, for we are immersed in a culture that for all practical purposes does not really believe in God. People blithely quote the words, "one nation under God," for our culture does believe in God. It is a God of its own making, not the creator and sustainer of the universe. Speculists believe that we are just animals, nothing on a higher order than animals, with no responsibility to our creator. Rather, they are quick to say, if there is a God, why does he not do something about blank? It is also popular in our culture for a person to try to find mitigating circumstances and to try to excuse the faults of others. For if they are not guilty or responsible, neither is he. After all, everyone does it, is the thinking. However, God will have none of our sophisticated reasoning or our excuses. We are individually responsible for our reactions to the events of life and for our spiritual and moral decisions. Today's aim. Facts. To see that Israel remained obstinate in their sinfulness and rebellion against God. Principle. To show that God's standards of sin and righteousness do not change and sin must be punished. Application. To understand that we can so order our lives that we are in a place of blessing, not in a place of judgment. The golden text reads, "Therefore wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, for my determination is to gather the nations, that it may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation." Zephaniah 3:8. Today we have 3 outlines. Sins against the Lord, Zephaniah 3:1 through 4. The second is testimony of the Lord, Zephaniah 3:5 through 6. The third is rejection of the Lord, Zephaniah 3:7 through 8. Introduction. Disobedience to the Lord has consequences. Adam and Eve learned this lesson. So did those in Noah's day, presumably before all but 8 people on the earth perished in the flood. 800 years before Zephaniah issued his prophecy, the Lord delivered his chosen people from Egyptian bondage and brought them to Mount Sinai. The Lord met with Moses on that mountain, and the entire Israelite nation promised, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." Exodus 19:8. He promised them blessings, prosperity, and safety if they obeyed his commands. But he also promised curses, hardships, and defeat if they disobeyed him. Leviticus 6:27. Zephaniah's task was to spell out for the people of his day the reasons for the coming judgment of God upon them. For centuries they disobeyed God's commands, and the time of reckoning had finally come. Sins against the Lord. Zephaniah 3, verse 1. Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city. Verse 2. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in the Lord, she drew not near to her God. Verse 3. Her princes within her are roaring lions, her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw at the bones till the marrow. Verse 4. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. By the city of Jerusalem. Zephaniah 3, verses 1 through 2. In verses 4 through 15 of chapter 2, the Lord declared that the coming wrath was not limited to Judah alone. His punishment would come upon the Philistine cities to Judah's west, the countries of Moab and Ammon to the east, the Ethiopians to the south, and once great Assyrian empire to the north, along with its mighty city of Nineveh. Zephaniah 3 returns to God's message for Judah and specifically the city of Jerusalem. The city is not named here, and the reader might first think that the Lord was still addressing Nineveh. However, the following verses make it clear that Jerusalem is in view. In Zephaniah 3:1, it introduces the indictment of Jerusalem, suggesting the city's fate is sealed. Jerusalem is called filthy and polluted. The Hebrew word for filthy may imply rebellion. The city that is its inhabitants refused to obey God and his law, even when they were clearly told what his will was. The city was polluted by idolatry and false religion. The name Jerusalem most likely means city of peace, but the Lord called it tyrannical, oppressive city. It mistreated the most vulnerable in society, widows, orphans, and the poor, so that they were robbed of justice. Jerusalem was graciously blessed by God, whose temple still stood in the city in Zephaniah's time. Yet in the end, it would fare no better than its pagan neighbors. Jerusalem, rather than becoming God's faithful covenant city, in contrast to her pagan neighbors, is a fact one with them in sinfulness and unfaithfulness. The people of Jerusalem made the same mistake so many people today make. They assumed that because there were no immediate consequences for their evil actions, they could continue in them without fear. God's amazing patience, however, does not mean his holy requirements can continually be ignored. Yes, this is exactly what the people of Jerusalem did. They did not obey the voice of God through his prophets and his written word. According to the Chronicle, they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people. Jesus later reminded people of this sad history in Matthew 23:37. Nor did the people receive the Lord's correction. Zephaniah 3:2. This refers to God's fatherly discipline of his people. God chastised or disciplined Israel in order to teach them to be faithful to him and enjoy his blessings, but they refused the lessons he taught. Furthermore, Jerusalem did not trust in the Lord. The people did not seriously take his words and place their faith in him. For them, their modern day people, seeing was believing. They heard God's promises but did not trust him in the face of what they saw in daily life. They chose instead to trust in themselves, in their own might, and even in the idols of their pagan neighbors. Finally, the Lord declared that Jerusalem failed to draw near to him, though they still observed religious ceremonies. They did not draw near to God in faith, worship, and repentance. Instead, they estranged themselves from him, even though he sought to be near them. Faith is a matter of the heart. Outwardly, we can do all manner of good and religious works, but such things are useless if they do not flow from hearts that trust God and seek his presence. By the civil leaders, Zephaniah 3:3. The charges listed in verse 2 were levied against the people of Jerusalem in general. Now the Lord's message turned to the leaders of the people in particular and their sins against the Lord. The princes were civil leaders or rulers. They were not necessarily of royal household, but served under the king. The Lord called them roaring lions. The latter part of the verse described them as wolves. It would seem that the image of lions emphasized the ruler's power, and that power was used to satisfy their own desires as they devoured their own people like prey. Interestingly, kings, the highest officials in the land, are not mentioned here. Most of Judah's kings were wicked and worthy of God's condemnation. It is probable, however, that kings are omitted because then current King Josiah sought the Lord and sought to bring his people back to the worship of the true God. His efforts, though unsuccessful in the long run, were honored by God. Jerusalem's judges also were guilty before the Lord. The word judge could apply to any of various government officials, but the word itself is related to the word for justice. These civic leaders were to see that justice was done for all the people, but the Lord described them as ravenous wolves who preyed on the people they were to protect. The last phrase probably means that the wolves left nothing until the morning because they were so intent on devouring their prey. The picture in Zephaniah 3:3 is of leaders whose sole priority was their own pleasure and comfort. They should have been examples of godliness in their service to the people, but instead they forced the people to serve them. There was no justice in the city because of the city's unjust leaders. By the religious leaders. Zephaniah 3:4. Throughout Judah's history, God had faithfully sent prophets to his people to call them back to obedience and holiness. Among these prophets was Joel, Isaiah, and Micah. However, it seems that wherever there are true servants of God, there are also false servants, people who claim to speak for God and serve God, but really serve only their own self interest. Not everyone who claimed to be a prophet was in reality sent by God. Though Zephaniah was himself a prophet of God, the Lord spoke through him, condemning other prophets who were light and treacherous persons. They were guilty of levity, trifling with the weightiness of matters. There was no gravity or steadfastness in their life or teachings. These false prophets were also treacherous, meaning they were deceitful and untrustworthy. Yet sadly, they were looked to as spiritual leaders in Jerusalem and Judah. The priests were equally corrupt. They were supposed to represent the people before the Lord, but they had polluted the temple. This may suggest their participation in the idolatry mentioned earlier, or their failure to honor the Lord through appropriate sacrifices and offerings. Ungodliness in their personal lives likewise should have profaned the holy place that was dedicated to the Lord. Moreover, the priests did violence to God's law. This probably refers to their failure to follow the law in their practices, but it probably also refers to their distortion of God's revelation in their teaching, thus leading people astray. Testimony of the Lord. Verse 5. The just Lord is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his judgment to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame. Verse 6. I have cut off the nations, their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste, that none passes by. Their cities are destroyed, so that there is no man, that there is no inhabitant. Zephaniah 3:5 presents a stark contrast to what has preceded. The city of Jerusalem was filled with wicked, rebellious people, and that were led by profane, self-serving princes and judges. Even the religious leaders of the people were corrupt. Yet the Lord had not yet abandoned his people. He was still present in their midst. The Lord's temple stood in Jerusalem. This was the place where his earthly presence was specifically manifested. Yet we must remember that God is omnipresent, he is present everywhere at the same time. This seems to be the intent here. Although the people did not draw near to him, he was near, and his presence made their sin all the more detestable and their judgment all the more certain. As the righteous Lord, he is the true standard by which all people are measured, and he does nothing wrong. The term judgment is best understood and translated as justice. Thus, not only is the Lord just, but he also continuously, morning by morning, manifested his justice and righteousness before the people, and his treatment of both Israel and the surrounding nations. Sadly, God's righteousness and justice made no impression on the people of Jerusalem. Their lives and actions manifested injustice, and they felt no shame for it. They were callous and unfeeling. They did not look to God as measure of their actions, for he had no place in their lives. Not only was the presence of the just Lord a testimony against his people, but so also was the Lord's actions. Zephaniah 3:6 describes the devastation the Lord brought upon other nations. While Judah enjoyed relative peace during Josiah's reign, the surrounding nations did not fare so well, as this was the doing of their sovereign Lord. He had cut off these nations, meaning that he had brought them down or destroyed them. He was the one who made their towers or strongholds desolate and removed the inhabitants of their city so that all activity ceased. Rejection of the Lord. Verse 7. I said, surely thou wilt fear me. Thou wilt receive instruction, so their dwelling should not be cut off. Howsoever, I punished them, but they rose early and corrupted all their doings. Verse 8. Therefore, wait ye upon me, said the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. The divine judgments that came upon the neighboring countries should have served as more than adequate warnings to the people of Jerusalem and Judah. They were God's provocation to the people of Judah to fear the Lord and to keep their dwelling place from being destroyed. If they had heeded the warnings and learned from them, the people could have been spared the judgment that the Lord had already announced. He had graciously sent them these divine warnings through his prophets, but they had not listened to them. Instead, they got up early to act corruptly. The picture is of a people who were eager and enthusiastic to carry out their evil deeds. Judah's continuous rejection of God's warning amounted to a rejection of God himself. Having rejected God, there was nothing more to do but wait for the day of the Lord and the judgment it would bring. The godly remnant of people among them also had to dread divine judgment to come. God's wrath would fall upon them as if they were his prey, and it would come within a few years. The Lord attached to this a statement about his determination to gather all the nations and kingdoms in order to pour out his wrath upon them all. Indeed, he said, all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Zephaniah 3:8. While Judah would suffer God's wrath shortly, this latter part of the verse looks beyond that day of judgment to the final day of the Lord, when his judgment will come upon all the nations. This final judgment on the believing nations will occur when Christ returns. Revelations 19:11 through 21. No matter how wicked the culture is in which we live, the Lord is still present. He is still warning and he is still teaching. Like Judah of old, our nation might not listen to him, but our personal responsibility remains the same: to obey him, follow him, and be a light in the darkness until the day Christ returns and sets all things right. His justice and righteousness shall reign on earth. Questions. 1. What terms did the Lord use to describe Jerusalem? 2. What had Jerusalem failed to do? 3. Of what were Jerusalem's civil leaders guilty? 4. Who were the prophets that Zephaniah's message condemned? 5. What had Judah's priests done? 6. Who did the Lord say was in the midst of Jerusalem? 7. How did the Lord describe himself in contrast to the inhabitants of the city? 8. What had the Lord done to nations surrounding Judah? 9. What should Judah have learned from God's dealings with neighboring countries? How did the people of Judah respond? 10. What was coming for Judah and Jerusalem? What is yet to come for all the nations of the earth? This concludes our Sunday school lesson for Sunday, June 12, 2016. Thank you for listening. God bless.